And now I'd like to introduce Patrick Armstrong. Patrick is a transracial Asian American adoptee, a podcaster, speaker, and activist. And he's also the co-founder of the Asian Adoptees of Indiana group that creates a safe community for Asian adoptees. He'll be sharing his adoption journey with us tonight. So welcome, Patrick. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ty. Thank you to Adoption Network Cleveland for having me here. Excited to be here with you all tonight to share a little bit about my journey. I just want to shout out to Julius and Betsy as well for being behind the scenes and making this all happen. Um, I am going to share my screen now and get started. Can everyone see just the slides? Okay, I'm seeing head nods. Yes, so I'm going to assume that the right screen is up and just let me know if you have any trouble. But tonight I'm going to be talking about my adoption journey. I call it coming to consciousness because that is the kind of framework that I like to use to talk about my journey. And I'll talk a little bit about why as well. I gave me a really great intro, but I just want to share a little bit more about myself. Yep, my name is Patrick Samuel Young Armstrong, Samuel being my adoptive father's name and Young being part of the given Korean name or the Korean name that I was given at the adoption agency where I was taken into when I was born in Korea. That's where I was born in South Korea, allegedly in Seoul, as far as I know, and adopted by a white family in rural Indiana, where I grew up. I am a podcaster and public speaker. If you happen to know who I am, the two logos up here are the two podcasts that I host. I've been doing that for almost 4 years now. The first one on the left is the John Chi Show. Started that in September of 2020. It is about the Korean adoptee experience. It is myself and two other Korean adoptees who I met randomly online. And we just decided that it was a good idea to do a podcast together and to talk about these experiences, despite having never done so before. And so we've been doing that. We are called the John Chi Show because John Chi in Korean means to feast or to celebrate, as we like to talk about it. And we celebrate our stories, our identities, our shared cultural heritage as Korean adoptees. And at the end of every episode, we try a snack or a drink item, usually from Korea, but sometimes just generally from the continent of Asia. And that is the feast portion of the show. The second logo, the CP, stands for Conversation Piece. That podcast is about the missing pieces of the conversations that we're already having. A lot of adoption related topics that I talk about on there, but also I just talk with a bunch of different people about whatever it happens to be or whatever they happen to be doing in their lives, whatever industry or community that they come from, and whatever they feel like is something that's missing, something that's just below the surface of the conversations that we might normally hear about. A couple other fun facts about me. I currently live in Indianapolis. That's where I am calling in from tonight. And I live there with my wife, our cat, and our first child, who is a month and a week old. Should be 6 weeks on Friday. So, been doing a lot of newborn parenting stuff. And last but not least, I am a big Purdue men's basketball fan. So I'm riding the wave right now. If any of you are college basketball fans, this year's the year. But that's a little about me. If you have any other questions or anything, feel free to reach out to me after this. You can follow me on Instagram. It's where I'm most active at
In
Patrick
terms
in
of
the
like knowing what
world.
I'm doing.
And you can see I write a lot about adoption, the adoptee experience there, and you can catch all of that stuff on my IG page. So without further ado, I will get started. I talked about calling my this presentation tonight coming to consciousness. And the reason I do so is because of this framework here, the adoptee consciousness model. This model was created and authored by five adoptees: Ron Kim, Susan Bronco, Grace Newton, Stephanie Kripa Cooper Luter, and Paula O'Laughlin. And I really, really, really resonate with this particular framework because first and foremost, it was adoptee created. And so the way that they describe it is this adoptee consciousness model is a critical consciousness model that moved beyond emergent awareness to describe the ongoing individual and collective movement towards social activism adoptees may encounter throughout their lifespan and considers intersecting racial, ethnic, and cultural identities while also promoting empathy for adoptees. The reason I resonated with this so much, again, because it was authored by adoptees, and also because a lot of the language that you may or may not have heard adoptees use when talking about their own journeys and the moments that they start to think critically about their own identities as adoptees, start to think critically about adoption as a process in itself, as a system, generally is framed as the fog or coming out of the fog. That is the dominant language that I came into consciousness with 3 years ago, and the language that I use most often to describe my journey. But it never sat right with me because this particular language, this particular phrase and framework was not created by an adoptee, but an adoptive parent. And I felt like as I was going through my journey, I really wanted to find and figure out some adoptee created, adoptee centered language that would help to describe the just the really the moments of critical consciousness that we come to, that really was for us by us. And so when this study came out late last year, it really, really resonated with me. If you, I have links to it. If you all are interested, I can definitely have Ty share that, or I can share that with you if you want to reach out. Highly recommended. It's only like 24 pages. It is a scholarly article, but it's really incredible. And this is the framework that I'm going to be talking about my journey tonight. And so there are 5 different stages, starting with status quo, then to rupture, dissonance, expansiveness, and then last but not least, forgiveness and activism. And so I'm going to talk about my story through these 5 stages. And then at the end, if you have, I have some takeaways for y'all. And then if you have any questions or anything, we can get into that at the end. But for now, I am going to go ahead and get started with the beginning of my story, which starts as all of these stories do in the status quo. So the status quo is, as they describe it, believing the dominant adoption narrative of being adopted, believing myths about why children are available for adoption, negative stereotypes about birth and first families, people and countries, poverty. It doesn't question individual, systemic, or structural factors leading to adoption. And so for me, I was in the status quo from the moment that I was adopted to my 30 and a half years old, June of 2020. And so the reason I was in the status quo is because personally, I grew up in a stereotypically positive adoption experience. I had a really loving family. They had a certain amount of privilege within their community. I grew up in a predominantly white community, and that was the environment that I found myself existing in when I came over to Indiana. And another thing that caused me to remain in status quo, not just through my early years, but all the way until I was 30, was when I was growing up, not I had this loving relationship with my family, had a lot of support from my adoptive parents, but we didn't talk about things like racism. We lived in a colorblind household. That's the way that we saw the world, the lens that my parents saw the world through. Again, a predominantly white community. There are very few people of color. I looked up on Wikipedia one time. There was 0.02% Asian population in the town that I grew up in, which I'm almost positive was just myself and my younger sister, who was also adopted from Korea, not biologically related to me. And it also toes this line of the common adoption narrative that I was given up for adoption so that I could have a better life. I internalized all of these things growing up because that was the only way that I understood the world and the only lens that I had to understand the world through. I didn't have racial mirrors. I grew up in racial isolation. My parents never were given the tools and resources and education to understand that these types of things might be harmful to a person of color, a child of color, as they form their identity. And so for me, I ended up rejecting my Asian identity very early on as a way for me to make sense of these surroundings in order to survive my surroundings and to be accepted by both my family and the community that I was part of. One particular memory that stands out happened in first grade, my first day of first grade. I went to a Catholic school and I walk into the gym and I'm looking around. I'm trying to find somewhere, some people that I might be able to sit next to. And a kid runs up to me, and before I can say anything, he pulls his eyes back at me and go, "How do you even see out of those things?" And then ran away. Um, I did not. This was my first real encounter with racism or microaggressions. I didn't understand what was going on at that time. I just knew that it didn't really feel good. And instead of going to tell an adult or a guardian figure, even my parents, for some reason, it just felt like this was something I couldn't share. And so even back in first grade, I felt like this was something that I couldn't talk about. And so I never told anybody. And I look back on this moment as being the foundation for all of this rejection that I would go through. And it set the tone for being in middle school in seventh grade when I was at a basketball game in another city, and a parent yelled at me from the stands to go back to my own country. It also set the stage for something like working at a family restaurant that I used to do in high school and having a patron who I saw constantly every weekend, and sat them in the same booth, and they told me that I was working at the wrong restaurant because there was a generic Chinese restaurant that had opened up down the street. And in each of those instances, instead of feeling instead of showing outward like that I had been harmed, I internalized. And all of these things told me that, hey, being Asian is not good. Being Asian is bad. It's looked down upon. It's something that, I don't feel very good about and other people don't feel very good about. And so it formed this foundation of rejection, and not only rooted in being rejected due to adoption, but seriously rejecting the identity of myself and wanting to be white. There was another time where I came home one day and I just prayed to God. And one of the things that I prayed about was, why did he make me this way? And instead of being able to, again, to talk about any of these things, because we were living in this colorblind household and community, because we didn't talk about race or racism, I didn't share any of these things with my parents. And whenever I tried to have a conversation, it would always lead to, well, I think you're just taking that the wrong way, or that was just a joke, or you're being overly sensitive, things of that nature. And it just caused me to create a mask, to create this barrier of, again, rejection in order to survive. And I do want to continue to caveat that I had a very positive relationship with my parents and even with the community around me. However, these experiences built that foundation. And so status quo is the stage that I spent most of my life in. I'm 34 now. I just turned 34 on Friday, and I again didn't come to consciousness until 30. And one particular story that I have that shows why I stayed in this mode and navigated the world this way happened in college when I was at Purdue. And so we have this backdrop of all of these things that have happened for me from the moment I was adopted till I was 18 years old, go off to college. And this is the time when you're supposed to be finding yourself, when you're supposed to be making connections, you're supposed to be exploring new things. And I was still navigating the world in this zone of comfortability around my predominantly white friend group, around the rejection of my Asian identity. And around the sophomore year in college, which is what this right picture is supposed to be representing, even though it's a picture of me as a freshman in high school, I was sitting in a lecture class at Purdue, waiting for the class to start, and out of the corner of my eye, I clock an Asian student walking towards me, and I could hear it felt like they were trying to get my attention, and they were saying something to me, and I could hear that it was a language I didn't recognize. And internally, I told myself, okay, this is a moment for you. You can either engage with this person and take your first steps into, this Asian community, or you can continue in this zone of comfortability that you've been navigating the world in. And I thought about my experience in this very short amount of time, and I had already had encounters with other Asian students who, when I told I was adopted, told me that I wasn't really Asian. And so I had some negative experiences with other students, but I thought to myself, like this is a crossroads moment for whatever reason. And I chose the former option of staying in this rejected space. And I turned to the person, the student walking up to me, and I waved him off and I said, "I'm sorry, I don't understand, the language that you're speaking." And I just kind of turned away. And they turned away and walked out of my life. And for a long time I never thought about that. But and since coming to consciousness, since thinking about my experience, I realized that all of those things that happened to me as a child, the rejection of my identity, this mask that I formed, led to this really pivotal moment in college where I had an opportunity to step out of that zone. But I chose not to because the rejection of who I was as an Asian American, as an Asian person, was so deeply ingrained in myself, I couldn't make the choice to take this on and step out of that comfort zone. And not only did that cause continued self harm to where I would continue to navigate the world the way that I'd always had, but it also potentially caused harm to the student who was maybe looking for connection, looking for community, looking for a friend. And I think about that. I think about that moment a lot because I think it's very representative of what the status quo is. I continue to uphold the dominant narrative of adoption that, my life was better off because I was adopted, that my, everything was all love, and that at the end of the day, this was what adoption was for everyone. And I wasn't able to address or unpack these very difficult negative feelings that I had about my own identity because I was upholding the status quo. And so that leads us to no June of 2020. And so in 2018, my wife and I moved to Chicago. My fiance at the time, now wife, and in May of 2020, the pandemic lockdowns started, and we decided that we were going to move back to Indianapolis because it was cheaper and we could live and we could have more space to live, and we just, it just seemed better for us at the time. And so we come back to Indianapolis, and there's a lot of stuff happening at this time. The pandemic. There is a very there Black Lives Matter has really come to the forefront with the killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, so many other people, and was just very much at the forefront of the public consciousness. Violence against Asian bodies was happening because of the pandemic and because of the rhetoric that had come out of the pandemic. And at the same time, my wife and I, having moved back to Indianapolis, we had just recently become engaged, and we were talking about not just wedding, but what it would look like to grow our family and have kids of our own, and what kind of parents we would be. Having that whole conversation, and all of that culminated into a singular moment of rupture. And so I'm going to describe rupture, and then I'm going to describe the event that happened. And so rupture, as defined by the adoptee consciousness model, states often occurs when an incident or event happens that provides potential evidence that contradicts previous views, experiences a rupture, the adoptee experiences a rupture, fragmentation, or wounding, forces the adoptee to rethink what they know about who they are or the master narrative of the status quo. And so we are sitting one June night on the couch in our living room in Indianapolis, and we're flipping through Netflix trying to find something to watch, and we land on a movie called Always Be My Maybe. It is an Asian American rom com starring Randall Park and Ali Wong. Very funny, a really good movie. And for whatever reason, we decided to watch that. And we click play, and the movie starts with a flashback. Minor spoilers for this movie, but it starts with a flashback, and their families are cooking a meal together. And in the backdrop of all of these different things happening, of family conversations, violence against Asian bodies, Black Lives Matter, pandemic lockdown, we're watching this movie and something clicks about this scene. And I realize that a switch has been flipped in my mind, and I turn to my wife and I say, how am I going to teach our kids to navigate this world as Asian when I don't know how to do that? And this was my moment of rupture. This confluence of events, this confluence of world events, intertwined with some personal things going on, made me click something, flipped some switch in my mind. And I really sat with that question. And the very next day, I got on my podcast player and I looked up Asian American podcasts, and I found a podcast called Dear Asian Americans, which sent me on another moment of rupture, which would lead me to doing a lot of adoption work. And so the always be my maybe moment was this moment of rupture for my ethnic and racial identity of being Asian. What does this mean to be Asian? And the first time that I ever had asked that question, had that thought consciously that I wanted to know more. And so I come across this podcast, I listen to the first episode, fall in love with it. I'm like, okay, yes, this is what I need to do. This is the kind of stories that I want to listen to. And the guest that I had just listened to said, if you're out there and you're listening, thank you. If you want to have a conversation, please feel free to reach out to me. And I worked a lot of sales jobs after college. And so I'm not afraid of the cold call or cold email. And so I sent this person an email and I just said, hey, I am a Korean adoptee. I've rejected my identity for a long time, or I don't know what it means to be Asian, and I don't know where to start. But this is something I feel like I need to do. And for whatever reason, this gentleman kindly responded to me and said, hey, thank you for your email. Glad to help you on your journey. I am not an adoptee, but I have a colleague who is an adoptee. And I've attached this study that they did that I hope can be helpful to you. And so I said adoptee, but at this point, I don't even think I'd ever used the word adoptee. I think I just said I'd been adopted. And I clicked the study, and this center picture that you see here is what came up. And so the study is called Too Korean to Be White, Too White to Be Korean, Ethnic Identity Development Among Transracial Korean American Adoptees by Joy Hoffman and Evelyn Vallejo Pena. And it is a study about 12 Korean adoptees who grew up in the Midwest, just like me. And so I sit down at my kitchen table, I open the study and I start reading. And about 30 minutes later, I kind of look up and I'm just soaked with tears. And I'm like, why am I crying? Why am I weeping at this scholastic article? Like, why am I weeping reading school papers? And it was because for the very first time in my life, I had seen my experience mirrored in any way. And it felt like the things that I was reading, the anecdotes that were relayed by the adoptees in the study, felt like it was ripped from my own history. And I just couldn't believe what I was reading. And that was the moment, that was the second moment of rupture, specifically regarding my adoptee identity and what it means for me to, what it meant for me to be adopted. And this was the first time that I ever thought to question the narrative of what it means to have been adopted, what it means to have been a product of the system of adoption. And I wasn't using that specific language at the time, but it was just this moment for me to be able to start thinking differently about not only who I was, but the circumstances that brought me to this point in time. And so that leads to stage three, which is dissonance. Dissonance. And so stage three, as defined, is feeling torn between multiple identities, an adoptee who wants to continue to believe the dominant narrative but knows there are flaws and begins to realize the dominant narrative can be used to harm rather than to protect them. And so dissonance for me was almost immediately upon starting to take in adoptee literature. I was connected with an adoption scholar named Sarah Park Dolan. She does adoption in Kids Lit. She's a Korean American master librarian, not an adoptee herself, but is married to an adoptee and has done a lot of critical studies on adoption representation in Kids Lit. And she gave me a whole host of books and things to read, one of them being Adopted Territory by Alina Kim, and Disrupting Kinship by oh my gosh, so many books. Kim McKee, Dr. Kim McKee, two of my quote unquote Bibles that I subscribe to and that really helped me learn about what it means to be adopted. And as I was reading about all of the different counter narratives that exist within the spectrum of adoption, it was really hard to reconcile some of the things that I had experienced on my own with what I was reading. And I realized going through and learning that my experience was really just that. It was my own experience. There were so many things about being adopted that I had no idea. And some of the things that people with these counter narratives, these experiences that were different than my own, that some of these things that they had experienced really resonated in my own story. These were some things that I felt, this rejection of identity, this disconnection and loss of culture, of community, of language, of country, all of these different things that other people experienced and then maybe had a much different, much more difficult experience with adoption. Some of these things that I was really able to resonate with. And through learning and through wanting to build community with other Asian adoptees specifically, I was able to connect with the two folks that you see here in this picture on the left, names KJ and Nathan. And in September of 2020, we ended up forming the John Chi Show. And one of the biggest aspects of my journey has been storytelling. Not only my own story, but specifically finding ways to utilize whatever platform I might have to facilitate and tell the stories of other adoptees. Because another thing that I was learning was that the story and experience that I have, this stereotypical positive adoption experience, was part of that dominant narrative, was part of that status quo, the stories that you always hear. Oh, he ended up in a better life. Oh, he had such great privilege. Oh, he assimilated so much into his community, into his family. And these are the stories that we're going to tell when we talk about adoption. And well, the stories that we don't hear, these other counter narratives, the stories of abuse, the stories of undocumented adoptees, the stories of children who had been trafficked, the stories of people who had been literally stolen from their homes and forced through these systems of adoption, and growing up in households that don't necessarily foster the type of support and love that I received. These are the stories that we are not hearing. And so as we started to build this show, it was really on the backbone of, okay, we want to be able to utilize the storytelling that we do for ourselves to help tell other people's stories. And so that's what we did. We started with the telling of our own and immediately started to bring on guests, other Korean adoptees whom we shared identity only. And that was it. And started to learn so much from other people. And this was the point that I really started to reclaim this part of myself, the Asian identity, the Asian American identity, the adoptee identity. I started to move out of that state of rejection after 30 years and started to think about what it means to actually live in to these things and be a part and become more whole with these different parts of my identity that I either had no idea of or was actively rejecting. And so we were doing this show weekly, talking to different people at all times, uplifting their stories in whatever ways that we could, and getting to meet a lot of really incredible people. Mind you, this was still going on during the lockdowns. We were different states, literally three different time zones, trying to do this show, and all of the community that we were building was online. And what we found was there was a hunger for this type of story, this type of storytelling. A lot of adoptees were coming to consciousness at this time and seeking community in order to tell and share their stories or to just resonate with people whom they did not know, but were able to share this lived experience. And so we continue to do that through podcasting, through apps like Clubhouse, a lot of different things. And that was the mode of reclamation that I was in for quite a long, or for at least 6 months until March of 2021 when the Atlanta spa shootings happened. And so as I was moving through this reclamation of my adoptee identity, a lot of it was Asian adoptee focused, but I think we were more so focused on the adoption aspect of it. And that's what I was thinking about when it came to my own story, taking DNA tests, different things like that, writing about adoption and my experience online. the spa shootings happened in Atlanta, where a white gunman, went into 3 different spas and killed 8 people, 6 of them specifically being Korean women in Atlanta, and it was real. It was a real traumatic moment in Asian America specifically, and something that I had been struggling with up until this point was finding my place within that wider Asian America. Within Asian adoptee spaces, yes, something that I felt very comfortable in or finding comfort in. It was something that I felt like I was able to move through and navigate through. That was great. However, when it came to this broader Asian American community, I found myself thinking about those experiences in college where people were other Asians. When I told them, oh, I was raised, I was adopted, raised by white parents, they would tell me, well, you're not really Asian then. And that felt like the experience I was still having. Atlanta changed all of that. That was the first time that I felt like, okay, I felt connected to this broader Asian diaspora for the very first time in a way that I never had before. And it's really terrible that trauma and tragedy is something that had to bring this kind of connection about. And it did allow me to finally take the kind of steps and build up the kind of confidence that I needed to move past or move through this idea that I'm not Asian enough because I was adopted by white parents, but that I am Asian too. And that I deserve to be in this space as well. And that I have a story to share within this larger diaspora. And if we are going to combat things like a spa shooting, it takes all of our community coming together to be able to have these conversations. And so that started the moment of really pushing back on the narrative of because I was a transracial, interracial adoptee, that I couldn't be truly Asian. I couldn't truly move in these spaces. And it moved me into stage 4, which is expansiveness. And so, expansiveness, as relayed by the adoptee consciousness model, in this time of reinvention or reincorporation of beliefs, adoptees come to embrace the paradox and are able to see multiple perspectives, growing, changing, being mindful and thoughtful of those who do not share our perspectives. The work here is about being able to embrace the both and of adoption. After Atlanta, I really moved into more of an advocate, activist role within the work that I was doing in the community. Um, I was speaking a lot more. I was learning a lot more about particularly the most impacted members of our community, undocumented adoptees, and adoptees who grow up in very negative situations due to adoption. And if I was not utilizing my platforms to tell stories and share and amplify those voices before, I was very much focused on doing so now. And so I was going to different places like Purdue, like IU, or Indiana University. I was going to different places in Michigan. I was going out to LA, to New York to be able to start incorporating the adoptee conversation within the broader Asian American conversation that was happening and realizing all of our struggles, everything that was going on is intertwined. They all intersect. Um, at the same time, again, I was embracing this both and aspect of who I was as a person, as both Asian and adopted, but also that place within both of these communities, and how that specifically affected me. And so this was moving through reclamation into what I call my acceptance phase of 2022. And this is where I was able to put all of these things together and realizing not only am I Asian enough, but that in terms of being an adoptee, in terms of my adoption experience, not only do I have loving parents, not only do I have this generally positive experience with adoption, I also did suffer harm because of adoption and because of the way that I was raised, because of the colorblind nature of our existence and the way that we navigated the world in my small rural hometown or town that I grew up in Indiana. Excuse me. I'm going to take a little sip here. Anyways, that both and was so important, not only for my own personal growth, but for me to start understanding the different aspects of the adoption constellation. And so part of that was understanding and thinking about the perspective of the birth parent, a pillar of our community that we do not, or who almost as often as adoptees is left out of the conversation, left out of the narrative, thinking about the reasons why I may or may not have been relinquished for adoption, thinking about all of the different things, the historical context in Korea at the time in the 90s when I was given up for adoption, and why those things might have been, starting to question and interrogate the story that I've been told that, oh, I was given up for a better life. Well, is that really the truth? It also allowed me to start thinking about the both and of my relationship with my adoptive parents and their own journey. For a little background, there was a really hairy period between 2015 and 2020 where my family and I, we were on a pretty rocky path. We just had very differing political views, some social views that were differing as well. And while I'd always had a really strong relationship with them, it was very strained. And so when I started this journey and started to share my story more, I wasn't really sure how it was going to be perceived. And again, going back to dissonance, upholding the status quo, wanting to continue to do that, I didn't want to strain my relationship with my parents any further. However, I knew that I had to tell my own story. I knew that I had to start unpacking and understanding my experience as an adoptee and as an Asian American. And for whatever reason, I was very lucky. My mom specifically started to listen to the podcast, and she has so far listened to every episode of the podcast. But during those early days, conversation wasn't really happening. And when Atlanta happened, I was very upset because that was a moment for me where I realized, oh, I haven't heard from my parents about the violence happening to other Asian people. I haven't heard from my predominantly white friend group about this violence, about what's going on. And there's been no check-in. There's been no recognition of whatever pain that I might be experiencing at the moment, let alone the rest of this community. And we recorded an episode where I talked about all of this. It probably call it a rant, episode 33 if you're interested. But I really went in on, or released, I guess, and expressed my frustration and my anger with everybody involved in this process. And it took a few days, but I knew that my mom was going to listen to this episode, and she'd listen to it. And I was sitting at work one day, about a week later, and I get a text from her, and she said she had listened to the episode, and she said, I just want to apologize to you for two things. One, for raising you in a colorblind household. We should not have done that. And two, that I understand now that I'll never understand what it's like to not be white. And this was a huge moment based on the 5-year period of us having this kind of strained relationship that I openly wept again. I'm a pretty emotional person, so a lot of crying within the story. I haven't touched on it too much, but openly weeping at my desk, and I had to leave work because it really felt like this is a moment of healing for my mom and I. And from that moment on, she has went on this journey of her own as an adoptive parent of 2 children of color, trying to understand and gain more nuanced understanding of what it means, not only her role as an adoptive parent, but also her role as just a white person in society, when it comes to these power dynamics that exist between the different aspects of the constellation, but also the different groups and racial and ethnic communities that exist in America and in this world. And part of that both and part of that expansiveness has been understanding that she is on her own journey. My dad is on his own journey. The people who have always been part of my community are on their own journeys. And as much as I can be accelerated in the journey that I'm on, understanding myself, reclaiming my identities, accepting who I am, I can't force other people to come to where I'm at. It's got to be their own journey. It's got to be something that they do on their own. And so expansiveness for me was really about not only finding acceptance out of reclamation and being able to truly accept the different aspects and parts of my identity, but also to be able to understand that both and relationship between the hypothetical scenarios of my birth family, and then also the very real and nuanced journeys that my adoptive parents were going on, which leads us to stage five, forgiveness and activism. As the model states, extrapolating beyond oneself, the adoptee begins to note systemic oppression in the complex history of adoption practices. The individual also begins the process of forgiveness and at the same time can challenge the dominant narrative. And so this was the opportunity. Moving into stage five was the opportunity for me to be able to not only forgive myself, but forgive the surrounding people or the people around me and the constellation, as we had been for so long, for 30 plus years, 33 years now. And finding myself in this mode, not only was there a heightened sense of the work that I was already doing and the work that I wanted to be doing within this space, both adoptee and Asian American led, but also to really take the storytelling pieces that I was doing to a whole new level. And that led to me creating my second podcast, Conversation Piece, to start addressing some of these deeper rooted issues that are just under the surface of the conversations that we already have. It also led to me starting my therapy journey after my second trip, or after returning from my second trip to Korea, and realizing that even though I had found acceptance of my own identities and felt like I had reached the mountaintop of this journey that I had been on as an adoptee, that there was another mountain to climb, and that was being able to love myself, truly forgive the different aspects of me who had made mistakes, who had held back on different things in terms of work or professional or personal life, who had been truly, truly wounded and felt like that wound was created by myself. Being able to find forgiveness for that person, find forgiveness for me, and then also really express love for that person, that whole version of myself, and become a more whole version of me. And also understand that the mountains will continue to be there as I move down the line of this practice. The other part of this is really making sure that I was holding myself accountable to the work and the storytelling that I was doing within this larger framework and the storytelling work that I was doing. And that means not only am I, again, sharing my own story, but uplifting and sharing the counter narratives that do not get the same shine as my story has always gotten. And to always be aware of the fact that there are other voices within the constellation, within our communities, within our diaspora that deserve and need to be able to be heard and uplifted in order for us to make the change within the systems, within the practices that we want to see. And so that's what that second picture is about, is just me in my element, talking to other people, having these deeper conversations, and realizing this is the way that we can move forward. This is what my skills and what my experience has brought me to, is a moment of being able to truly sit down across from someone and find our way to a deeper conversation beyond the surface level, and to be able to start addressing some of these problems that we see within adoption, that we see within our society, that we see in all of the different systems that we are a part of. Okay, so that's my story. Very truncated. Again, you can find a lot of my stuff on Instagram, a lot more in-depth writing pieces that I've done there, and that have talked about some of the complexities of my experience as well. Three takeaways from this particular journey. I know that I shared very specifically, but I just want to share that first, the adoptee experience is very complex and nuanced. There is no one or right way to be an adoptee. You just are. And all of us have our own journey to go on. All of us have our own path to walk. And there is no wrong way to exist. We just exist in this way, and we deserve to be able to exist as the people that we are. This journey is perpetual and it's never ending. And these stages can change at any time. You notice that the model is in a circular fashion. People can change stages at all times. For me, I'm bouncing between expansiveness, forgiveness, and dissonance a lot, because there's just a lot of complexity to this experience. And the last but not least, multiple things can be true and exist at the same time. That both and is so important to this conversation. So important to understanding the nuances of the adoptee experience and also the nuances of the constellation and the people that make up and are touched by adoption in whatever way that that might be. And so that's a little bit about me. That's a little bit about what I hope that you could take away from this conversation that we've had tonight. And if you have any questions, happy to answer them now. I'll turn it back over to Ty. But yes, thank you so much for having me and excited to answer any questions there might be.
Thank you so much for going through that. I really appreciated that framework and your story with it. That was a really, really great presentation. Um, we participants, when everyone registered, there was an opportunity to ask a question ahead of time. We had one person take us up on it. And the question was, what advice would you give adoptive parents to build a network of support for our adoptees, especially transracial adoptees? And they're looking for like a deeper answer besides racial mirrors or supportive birth culture, but like going deeper, how can adoptive parents um, do this work and be supportive of their children?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of answers to this question. I think the first one is for adoptive parents specifically the decentering of yourself and understanding that this particular journey is not your journey. It's not about you. While you play a big part and have a big role in this journey, it is always imperative to make sure that we are centering the adoptee as they walk this path. And that means for some people, for some adoptees, they're not going to be ready. They might not be ever ready for a long time. And while I think that racial mirrors and the other thing that was stated are, they are a little surface level. They are really important. And I think the importance is that for the adoptive parent, we always have to be giving the opportunities to connect, to engage with culture, with community, and with literature and education about these different things, about birth culture, about culture of origin, whatever it might be. And even when the adoptee doesn't want or isn't ready to do so. For me and my story, like the reason I rejected my identity so much is because I didn't have any of those mirrors. I didn't have any of those things. And Asianness was presented to me as being a detriment, as being bad. Just in the way that we talked about other people, just the way that we taught the type of media and things that we were taking in. And my parents didn't engage in Asian culture, in any Asian culture, specifically Korean culture. And a lot of that was due to the fact that when I was really young, they took me to a Korean culture something, like a convention in Indianapolis, and I left and I said that I hated it. And so to them, it seemed like, okay, well, he doesn't like this, so I'm never going to engage with that. Why would I? And for me, if I could go back and give them advice, it would be don't step away, don't stop, don't think that, oh, these are just the surface level things. It's your involvement as an adoptive parent, it's your engagement with these things that can show your adoptee that it's not bad to be Asian. It's not bad to be whatever ethnicity that you might come from or whatever identity that you might hold. It's really important to be able to show that even if as an adoptee they don't feel like, oh, I want to engage. It's whether it's just adolescence or being a teenager, whatever that might be, it is so important, I think, to as an adoptive parent be actively engaging in those things because again, when we're decentering ourselves as adoptive parents, we are ensuring that our actions, the things that we are doing to try and create that support system, that support network for the adoptee in our lives, is the first thing that we think of when we go to engage in a culture or do anything like that. And engaging with culture is about appreciation. It's not about appropriation. It's about wanting to do so, not for necessarily yourself, but for the adoptee in your life. And I would say that as an adoptive parent, if you're adopting from a child from another race or ethnicity or country, you should want to have that appreciation for that culture. And it should be a prerequisite that you have this understanding and ongoing education for that. And so I think that would be my answer, and I think there's a host of other answers to this question. But decentering yourself and making sure that you're staying actively engaged in these different opportunities, and that these opportunities are always present, even if they're saying no, even if the adoptee says no. Um, I would say one resource I recommend. It's a new book that just came out. It's called Adoption Unfiltered. By it is written by or co-authored by an adoptee, a birth parent, and adoptive parent. Um, it is absolutely fantastic. I think is an incredible resource for the entire constellation. And I think there are some really great tips and resources and tools provided by each one of those authors for a question like this.
That's great. And someone had mentioned earlier, I just wanted to share that as you've been talking about resources, I've been making notes of them so that I can share those out tomorrow with our follow-up email. And I might need to clarify a couple with you if I didn't get them just right. So we'll take care of that and make sure the group has that information. And we
Definitely.
had another question in the chat. There's two questions actually. One is about the question is, my son is 11 right now. He has a diverse group of friends, but few from his birth culture. I heard him and his friends making fun of his culture this past weekend and talked to them and told them it wasn't cool. Later, I talked to my son individually about it. Any advice for me as he's rejecting this part of himself?
I think it's really tough, and I think I would fall back on the answer that I just gave about providing opportunity to see his birth culture in a light in a positive light, I suppose. Obviously, there are nuances to every culture, and there are good and bad. And I think what's really difficult about this individual situation that we find ourselves in with adoption is that you are, as one person or parent, going up against a wave of society who has ideas and preconceived notions about specific cultures, communities, identities. And I think, again, that's why it's so imperative to model this appreciation for the culture at home. And I think that starts with having books that are both age appropriate and above, to that you are engaging in, that you're learning about. I think it looks like, okay, cooking, even trying to cook food. I think it looks like watching different programs on television or different things like that, finding different ways to appreciate that culture, that he can be aware of. And it's not about forcing him to, obviously, we don't want them to be like talking badly about their birth culture or any other culture, to be honest. But it is, I think, having the opportunity to see, oh, my parents are, they really appreciate this, and that's something that I want to look into myself. I think that is so important to model in the home, specifically because that's where they're coming back to most often. That's where they're going to see that, and it's not always this direct one-to-one conversation about you need to be more appreciative of this culture because that's where you come from. It's more so that I have this appreciation, and I'm developing this appreciation too. And you are always welcome to have that appreciation and develop it when you're ready. And at the end of the day, it's it's finding the time to sit down and maybe just read a story about someone from that birth culture, to read about quote unquote heroes or just people that have had impact on the culture, to really be able to start showing examples of folks who um, they can look up to within that specific culture that they come from, and to be able to be proud of something like that.
Great, thank you. We had one more question in the chat. Can you share about that first conversation with your adoptive parents regarding you questioning racial identity and the dominant adoption narrative as an adult?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because a lot of mine was very roundabout. Like I was able to approach my parents from a place of them having already listened to my podcast, of like a number of episodes. So hearing me kind of talk about this, and so they already had a little bit of an idea of kind of what I was going through at the time, and or at that specific time when I was first starting to have these conversations with myself and other adoptees. Um, that first conversation, though, where we really sat down, was a lot of them apologizing and for like, oh, I didn't realize that you were going through this. I'm so sorry, that we did this or X, Y, and Z. Like that was their approach to it. And for me, it was very much trying to let them know it. To me, came off as pity. And at the end of the day, it was very much me trying to let them know I'm not looking for pity. I'm really not even looking for sympathy. I'm looking for you to understand this is what happened. And it's like, it's a fact of my life, of my experience, that this is something that occurred even within the household. And I'm not placing specific blame on you for this. You didn't get great education from the adoption agency leading into adopting us. You didn't have, a community of other people to go and find. You had this experience with me where it was like, I didn't like this Asian thing. So that made you think, okay, this is what we're going to do. And this is how we'll raise you. And there's a number of different things. It's not about assigning blame. And so that's how I've been trying to approach these conversations with them. And those first ones were difficult because they felt like they had done something wrong. And in the grand scheme of things, it technically was wrong. And it was about having them again understand the both and of this. Like, yeah, that did suck that we had this experience together and that I rejected my identity so hard and now I'm having these questions about it. And it's important for y'all to sit and listen and not to just respond with, oh, I'm sorry, oh, we didn't know, oh, wanting me to maybe pity you, I guess, at the end of the day. And so that's how I would approach, or that's how I approached those specific questions. And because I had the privilege of doing this podcast over and over again, having other adoptees talk about it, when it comes to the dominant adoption narrative, like that's where they really started to understand and see a little bit more about, okay, maybe this isn't what I thought it was or what I was told it was. And my mom especially she went from like very much pro adoption to being like, adoption's not so great. And so, but that's been this very long journey. And again, it's about finding resources that they might be able to tap into as well, whether it be podcasts, whether it be books, that can help them see. Nicole Chung's All You Can Ever Know really helped my mom understand a little bit more about the complexities there.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that, Patrick. I appreciate it so much. In the chat, I left a link for some resources for adult adoptees and birth parents, as well as an evaluation. If you could all take a moment and fill that out. We appreciate everyone that joined us this evening, and thank you, Patrick, for sharing so much with us and for volunteering your time with us this evening. As many of you know, Adoption Network Cleveland is a nonprofit organization serving individuals and families impacted by adoption, kinship, and foster care through support, education, and advocacy. We are a membership organization, and we hope that you'll consider joining as a member. To find out more about our organization and to support our work, please visit our website at adoptionnetwork.org. And we hope to see you at some of our other programs coming up. Thanks for being here this evening.
Thanks, y'all.